The Tigray War, a brutal internal conflict that has ravaged Ethiopia since November 2020, is rooted in decades of political tension and historical grievances. At the heart of the conflict lies the complex relationship between the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or TPLF, and the Ethiopian federal government. The TPLF, once the dominant force in Ethiopian politics, saw its power diminish with the rise of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed in 2018. Abiy's reformist agenda, while welcomed by many, was seen by some within the TPLF as a threat to their long-held influence and autonomy. Tensions escalated further as Abiy's government pursued a policy of centralization, which the TPLF viewed as an attempt to undermine Tigray's self-governance. The TPLF's decision to hold regional elections in September 2020, in defiance of the federal government's postponement due to the COVID-19 pandemic, further exacerbated the situation. The stage was set for a confrontation that would have devastating consequences for the region and its people. The TPLF, with its history of armed struggle against previous Ethiopian regimes, maintained a formidable security force. This force, coupled with the party's deep-rooted support within Tigray, posed a significant challenge to Abiy's government. The federal government, for its part, viewed the TPLF's actions as a direct challenge to its authority and a threat to the unity of the Ethiopian state. The breakdown in trust and communication between the two sides created a dangerous vacuum, paving the way for violence to erupt. The international community, while initially focused on Abiy's reform agenda and his efforts to broker peace with Eritrea, largely failed to grasp the gravity of the situation unfolding in Tigray. Early warnings from regional experts and human rights groups went unheeded, and the international community's response to the crisis would later be criticized as slow and inadequate. As the world watched, the Horn of Africa braced itself for another chapter of conflict and bloodshed. On the night of November 4, 2020, the simmering tension between the Ethiopian government and the TPLF erupted into open warfare. Abiy Ahmed announced the launch of a law enforcement operation in Tigray, accusing the TPLF of attacking a federal military base in the regional capital, Mekelle. The Ethiopian military, backed by allied forces from the Amhara region and Eritrea, launched a full-scale assault on Tigray, plunging the region into darkness and chaos. Tigray, once a relatively prosperous region, found itself cut off from the outside world. Communication lines were severed, electricity grids were destroyed, and access to the region was tightly controlled by the Ethiopian military. The international community, caught off guard by the sudden escalation of violence, struggled to get a clear picture of the situation on the ground. Reports of atrocities began to emerge, but access to independent observers and journalists was severely restricted. The involvement of Eritrean troops, longtime enemies of the TPLF, added another layer of complexity and brutality to the conflict. Eritrean forces, accused of some of the most egregious human rights abuses during the war, were accused of massacring civilians, looting property, and destroying infrastructure. Their presence in Tigray, initially denied by both the Ethiopian and Eritrean governments, would have long-lasting consequences for the region. The conflict in Tigray quickly spiraled into a humanitarian catastrophe. Millions of people were displaced from their homes, fleeing to neighboring Sudan or seeking refuge in makeshift camps within Tigray. Hospitals and health centers were bombed, essential supplies were blocked, and widespread hunger became a grim reality for many. The world watched in horror as the humanitarian crisis unfolded, hampered by the Ethiopian government's restrictions on aid access and its attempts to control the narrative surrounding the conflict. The conflict in Tigray was characterized by a brutal campaign of ethnic violence, reminiscent of the darkest chapters of human history. Civilians, particularly Tigrayan men and boys, were systematically targeted for their ethnicity, subjected to extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances and torture. Massacres bearing chilling echoes of the Rwandan genocide were perpetrated by all sides involved in the conflict. leaving indelible scars on the collective psyche of the Tigrayan people. One of the most well-documented atrocities occurred in the ancient city of Aksum in November 2020. Eritrean troops, operating with the apparent complicity of Ethiopian forces, massacred hundreds of unarmed civilians over a period of several days. Eyewitness accounts collected by human rights organizations painted a horrific picture of indiscriminate killings, sexual violence, and looting. The Aksum massacre, a symbol of the brutality unleashed upon Tigray, sent shockwaves through the international community and raised urgent questions about the Ethiopian government's accountability for the actions of its allies. In western Tigray, ethnic cleansing became a grim reality for thousands of Tigrayans. Amhara regional forces, seeking to reclaim disputed territories, forcibly displaced Tigrayan civilians from their homes, often after subjecting them to violence and intimidation. Properties were looted and destroyed, farmlands were confiscated, and Tigrayan cultural and religious sites were vandalized or destroyed. The ethnic cleansing campaign in western Tigray, largely ignored by the international community, aimed to permanently alter the demographic makeup of the region and erase Tigrayan presence from the disputed territories. The targeting of civilians based on their ethnicity, a clear violation of international law, became a hallmark of the Tigray conflict. Mass graves, discovered in different parts of the region, served as grim reminders of the scale of the atrocities committed. The international community, slow to react initially, began to call for independent investigations into war crimes and crimes against humanity. The pursuit of justice and accountability for the victims of these atrocities would become a central demand of human rights groups, and a key challenge for any future peace and reconciliation process in Ethiopia. As the conflict in Tigray raged on, horrifying reports emerged of widespread and systematic sexual violence being used as a weapon of war. Women and girls, some as young as 6 years old, were targeted for their ethnicity, subjected to horrific acts of sexual violence including gang rape, sexual slavery, and mutilation. The perpetrators, often acting with impunity, included members of the Ethiopian National Defense Force, Eritrean troops, and allied militia groups. Hospitals and clinics in Tigray were overwhelmed with survivors of sexual violence, struggling to provide adequate medical and psychological care amidst the ongoing conflict and a severe shortage of essential supplies. The stigma associated with sexual violence, coupled with the destruction of healthcare infrastructure and the fear of reprisal, prevented many survivors from coming forward to seek help. The true scale of sexual violence in Tigray remains unknown, with many cases going unreported and undocumented. The conflict in Tigray also triggered a massive displacement crisis, uprooting millions from their homes and shattering communities. Fleeing from violence, indiscriminate attacks, and the fear of persecution, families were forced to make perilous journeys, often on foot, to seek refuge in neighboring Sudan or in overcrowded and undersupplied camps within Tigray. The displacement crisis exacerbated the humanitarian emergency in the region, stretching already scarce resources and exposing vulnerable populations to further risks. The use of sexual violence as a weapon of war and the forced displacement of millions constitute grave violations of international humanitarian law and amount to crimes against humanity. These atrocities, often employed as a deliberate tactic to terrorize and subjugate populations, have left deep scars on the social fabric of Tigray, leaving behind a legacy of trauma, displacement, and broken families. Addressing the needs of survivors, ensuring accountability for the perpetrators, and creating conditions for safe and dignified return will be crucial steps in the long and arduous process of healing and rebuilding Tigray.